Remember this beautiful lady? Yeah, the one that Eris saved. The beautiful temple knight that anime only is only seen for a very brief moment. But she actually had quite a significant role to play in the novels during this time period. Even so much that Rudeus himself meets her directly. And she plays a significant role to Rudeus and his party even making it to the central continent. But yeah, welcome back to yet another Mushoku Tensei skipped content video. Today, yes, we're focusing on Therese Latria, a temple knight of the holy country of Milis. We'll start with a refresher on the Eris the Goblin Slayer chapter, before diving into one of the biggest oofs in the skipped chapters of the Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation anime adaptation. A chapter that fills in the gap between the point that Rudeus leaves the holy country of Milis and arrives at the central continent. So let's get into it. To set our time period here, we have the point in which Rudeus is at the holy country of Milis. Eventually he'll go to reunite with his father, Paul, and during that time, Eris is currently fulfilling one of her dreams, to go out goblin slaying. So she goes to the Adventure Guild, gets a job to hunt down goblins. Eventually she's joined by Cliff Grimoire, and during their hunt they eventually find themselves wandering into a nearby forest. It was at this point that they stumble upon a temple knight guarding a blessed child. The temple knight's group was obviously ambushed by the assassins. Cliff himself identifies the child as a blessed child, and claims that if the assassins are coming after her, then it's obvious that they were sent by the Pope himself, because this blessed child was a candidate to become the next Pope. To give some context here, the Temple Knights were one of the 3 holy military orders. They were feared with their infamous Inquisitors, a group that was tasked with stamping out heresy. After Eris and Cliff were eventually spotted by the assassins, Eris rushed in and took them all out effortlessly, save for one who managed to flee. Eris did have a close call though, nearly being struck by a dagger with poison on it. But thanks to the knight watching her back, she narrowly escaped death herself. Once the dust settled, the knight thanked her, introducing herself as Therese Latria of the Temple Knights. Yes, that's right, the sister of Zenith Greyrat, meaning that she was Rudeus' aunt. During Zenith's skipped chapter in the first volume of the series, Therese was described by Zenith as someone she was jealous of. This being due to the fact that her sister was a free spirit. It was one of the many factors that led to Zenith running away from home. Which, yes, based on the fact that Therese is now a knight of the Temple Knights, leads you to believe that either Zenith was lying, or Therese shaped up since then. But no, back to Therese and Eris. When Eris introduced herself, she gave the name Dead End Reserved and claimed that she was a Superd. She was pretty much mimicking how Rudeus always introduced himself. Though what Eris didn't know was that under Therese's helmet, her face went taut. The Temple Knights as a whole advocated for the expulsion of all demon kind from the Milis continent. But yes, Therese quickly realized that Eris didn't really have any distinctive features that a Superd would have. At that point, she kind of just assumed that Eris gave a false name, and identified herself as something that the Temple Knights would view in hostility, because she wasn't interested in getting involved any further. It was a surprise to Therese, as Eris just saved someone very important, this blessed child, and most would technically seek out a reward. So with that, Therese memorized Eris' face before giving her parting words. Should you ever need assistance, ask for Therese of the Temple Knights. At the same time that Eris was out goblin slaying and technically assassin slaying, somewhere in the holy country of Milis, Reserved met with an acquaintance that he had saved many years prior in the Demon Continent. This person was Gash Broche, who upon hearing of Reserved's travels, immediately penned him a letter to give to the folks in charge at the West Port, thinking this could possibly give them safe passage and avoid another incident with the whole smuggling thing they had before. Rudeus, Eris, and Reserved continued their journey home by heading to the West Port. However, things didn't quite go according to plan, and Rudeus found himself in an unexpected chance encounter, all played out in the skipped chapter to the central continent. After arriving in Westport, Rudeus and his party went to the customs building to seek passage. After receiving his number, he took a seat along with Eris, while Reserved stayed standing nearby. Reserved spoke up. "Aren't you going to give him the letter?" I shook my head. "Not until they call out our number." "Well, if you say so." Eris was already a little fidgety. Understandable, since waiting patiently wasn't her specialty. After a moment, though, she muttered, "Rudeus, I think someone's looking at me." I looked around the room carefully this time, trying to spot the person that she was talking about. As it turned out, it was a guard. Many of them were shooting brief glances over at Eris' direction, and she was glaring back at them, of course. "Please don't start a fight with them, Eris." I wasn't planning on it. That was somewhat difficult to believe. In any case, you had to wonder why they were looking at her anyways. No plausible explanation really came to mind. Were they just captivated by her beauty? Nah. Eris was definitely growing prettier by the day, but she was still a child. Unless all the knights working here were pedo scumbags. That couldn't be what was going on here. "Number 34, please come forward." Anyways, they'd finally call our number, so I stood up and headed towards the counter. I explained to the receptionist that I wanted to book passage to the central continent. Then I handed over the letter. She took it from me and smiled politely. But when she looked over the name written on the envelope, her expression grew somewhat dubious. "Wait just a minute, please." With that, she stood up and walked off into the rear of the building. After a little while, I heard a loud thump and a sound of someone shouting. An armored soldier. Soon, hurried from the back, approached another guard, and whispered something in his ear. The guard proceeded to run out of the office with a very serious expression on his face. All this struck me as somewhat ominous. I handed over the letter because I trusted Reserved, but maybe it would have been smarter if they did a little bit of digging of this Gash Broche character. Sorry to keep you waiting. The receptionist from before had returned. Her businesslike smile couldn't hide the tension on her face. Duke Bakshiel says he'll see you now. I had an extremely bad feeling about this. I am Duke Bakshiel von Weiser, director of the Mills Continent's Customs Office. This hog bore a strong resemblance to a pig. Whoops, my mistake. This man bore a strong resemblance to a pig. His neck was so enormously fat that his chin had disappeared completely. His light blonde hair was plastered to his forehead, and there was huge bags under his eyes. He had a face of a crafty, nasty old man. He was also scowling at us with open hostility. I seen a guy like this a lot back in the day. Every time I looked at the mirror. Humph, to think that a filthy demon would be brazen enough to bring me a letter like this. Duke Bakshiel was seated in a luxurious leather chair, which he didn't seem inclined to leave. It squeaked underneath him as he tapped the piece of paper in his hand with a pen. There was countless pieces of paper on his expensive-looking desk. Among them, I spotted a familiar envelope, now torn open. Presumably, he was holding the contents. You certainly chose an impressive name. I'll give you that. And that seal looked very real as well. But I wasn't born yesterday, my friends. This is obviously a fake. Bakshiel tossed the letter carelessly over at us. I reached out on reflex and caught it. It read, "This man is of the superb. Nonetheless, I owe him a great debt. He is a man of few words, but noble in character. Waive all customary fees and see him safely to the central continent. Signed, Galgard Nash Vennik, Commander of the Missionary Knights." Reserved's got some connections. One look at the name at the bottom left my head spinning. What happened to Gash Broche? Who was this Galgard Nash Vennik guy? It took a few seconds for me to realize that you could shorten Galgard Nash as Gash. Maybe he was the kind of guy who introduced himself using a nickname. Reserved might have gotten the impression that he really was named Gash. Although, that didn't explain the whole Broche part, of course. More importantly though, Commander of the Missionary Knights? He was seriously the leader of one of the 3 holy military orders? This was giving me a serious headache. Why would Reserved's old acquaintance be a major figure? It did make sense though in some ways. The commander of the Missionary Knights had to be someone pretty high ranking in the Mills hierarchy, right? It might not go over very well if everyone knew that this guy was friends with a superb. Maybe that's why he used a false name. Of course, there were simpler explanations for that. It had to be 40 years since Reserved met the man. Maybe he got married into a powerful family and changed his name or something. Bakshiel spoke up again. In the first place, there's not a chance that close-mouthed man would write a letter like this. I know him well, and I know that he detests putting pen to paper, even when it's simply necessary. Do you really expect me to believe he wrote this on behalf of a lowly demon? What a farce. Reserved listened to all this silently, with a conflicted expression on his face. This man was asserting flat out this letter was a fake simply because he was a superb, or so it likely seemed to him. And he might not be entirely wrong about that, to be honest. Paul had warned me that Duke Bakshiel was famous for his hatred of demonkind. Surely this Gash, or Galgard, was aware of that, right? If he knew what Bakshiel was like, he should have written a letter that was more thoroughly explained. Was the man really not who he claimed to be then? No, remember what Reserved told you. He met Gash in a building big enough that he compared it to the Kishirishu Castle. That would be very large for a home or mansion. But what if it was the headquarters of the Missionary Knights? That would likely be a larger building, with many knights inside of it at all times. And if Gash was the commander, all of those knights would be his subordinates. That would explain why Reserved said that he had many men. Of course, figuring that all wasn't necessarily helping us at the moment. Duke Bakshiel had already made up his mind about the letter being fake. Since things have come this far, saying, "Yes, it's a fake, sorry about that," wasn't going to end well. I took a step forward and spoke up. "In other words, you believe this letter to be a forgery, sir? Who are you supposed to be?" He looked at me suspiciously. "I don't have time to prattle with the child." Rudeus thought, wow, this was kind of a new feeling in a way. It had been a long time since anyone was this condescending to me, you know? When I wanted to be treated like a child, people treated me like a grown-up. But when I wanted to be treated like a grown-up, people would treat me like a child. What a nuisance. Keeping these thoughts to myself, I put my right hand to my chest and bowed in the style of Austrian nobility. "My apologies, sir. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rudeus Greyrat." Rudeus Greyrat, you say? That's correct. While I blush to admit it, I am a small, unworthy part of the Greyrat clan that is counted amongst Austrian nobility. But the Greyrat families use the name of ancient wind gods to distinguish themselves, do they not? That is true, sir. I belong to a branch family, and therefore have no right to use one. The instant the word branch family left my mouth, I could see the caution in Bakshiel's eyes give way to disdain. But before he could say anything, I indicated Eris with the palm of my hand. However, Lady Eris here is a true-born member of the Boreas Greyrat family. When I clapped her lightly on the back, Eris took a step forward as well. She looked at me in surprise for a moment, but didn't panic. At first, she folded her arms and spread her feet shoulder width, but quickly realized that wasn't right. Her second impulse was to reach for the edge of her skirts to do a curtsy. Unfortunately, she wasn't wearing a skirt. She finally settled on putting her hand to her chest and bowing as I had. I am Eris Boreas Greyrat, daughter of Philip Boreas Greyrat. A pleasure to acquaint you, sir. Her delivery was a little stiff. Also, it felt like she messed up that last bit. I glanced over to Bakshiel's face. It was hard to tell how he was taking this. But, whatever. We just have to lean hard on the influence of Eris' family here. Humph. And what is the daughter of the Osran nobility doing here, pray tell? That was certainly an obvious question at this point. Fortunately, there was no need for us to answer it with anything but the truth. Sir, are you familiar with the calamity that befell the Fatoa region some 2 years ago? Of course, many Osrans were teleported all around the world, as I understand. That's correct. The young lady and myself were 2 of those affected. Reese went on to explain to Bakshiel that he had escorted Eris all the way from the Demon Continent, with Reserved as a hired bodyguard. When crossing over to Millis Continent, they barely managed to afford the voyage by selling all their assets. But they didn't have enough funds to pay for the journey from the Millis Continent to the Central Continent. In particular, the cost of Reserved's passage was simply too high. Accordingly, we turned to Sir Galgard for help, as he both was old acquaintance of the Greyrat family and personal friend of Reserve's. He had been kind enough to write us a letter. This story wasn't quite the truth, of course, but it felt close enough. Ruse continued, the lady may be dressed as an adventurer at the moment, but that's solely because we didn't want any ruffians realizing that she was noble birth. I'm sure you can understand the potential dangers, Duke Bakshiel. I see, said Bakshiel, the expression on his face still sour. So that's how it is. You're in league with that Fatoan search and rescue squad that has been causing no end of trouble in Milshin recently, aren't you? What? No. What are you talking about, sir? I've never heard the name Eris Boreas Greyrat before, said Bakshiel with a distinctively swine-like snort. However, I am familiar with a certain Paul Greyrat, a thuggish little man who's supposedly taken to stealing slaves by force. Oh, lovely. Daddy's got a real reputation. Let me make sure I understand you, Duke Bakshiel. You believe that Sir Galgard's letter is a forgery. And Lady Eris is not truly a member of the Osran nobility, yes? And you take us for mere lackeys of a worthless lecher Paul Greyrat, who drinks all day, lashes out at his own son, has smelly feet, and causes his poor daughter no end of worry? Indeed. Reese thought, honestly now, what a terrible thing to say. Paul was trying his best out there. To be sure, he had his flaws, and some of his methods might be less than perfect, but to dismiss him as worthless? Now, that was just offensive. May I ask how you concluded the seal on the letter was inauthentic? I said, pointing to the envelope on Bakshiel's desk. The man frowned slightly and nodded. It's not uncommon for forgeries of the Missionary Knight's seal to circulate in the black market. Reese thought, really? That was the first I've ever heard of that. And why don't you see that my employer, Lady Eris, is not what she claims to be? Pah! Do you really expect me to believe this rustic boar of a swordswoman was the daughter of an Osran noble? I glanced over to Eris, who assumed her usual cross-arm pose. While her arms weren't marked with any scars, they were tanned and more tightly muscular than your average young adventurers. Not exactly what you would expect from a sheltered little princess, that's for sure. Ah, I said with a small snort of laughter. It appears you're not familiar with Sir Saros then. Saros? You mean the Lord of Fatoa region? Apparently, he'd recognize the name at least. Good. I do. He's also Eris's grandfather, and the man who chose to nurture her talents with the sword from a young age. What? Why would he do such a thing? This is something of a family secret, but it was decided some time ago that Lady Eris would marry someone in the Notos family, and Sir Saros detests the current head of the house. I see. Reese thought, just to be perfectly clear, I was implying that Eris had been trained to be a savage little warrior, so that she might one day murder the head of the Notos family in his bedroom. Fortunately, Eris seemed puzzled by my words. If she understood what I was saying, I would probably have lost a few teeth at that point. For that reason, among others, the young lady must return to Osra. Should you insist that she's an imposter, we'll simply have to return to Milshin and file an appeal with the appropriate authorities. Reese thought to himself, I had no idea what those appropriate authorities would even be in this case, of course. It wasn't something I had bothered looking into. Bakshiel replied, If you want me to believe all this, then show you some sort of proof. Sir Galgard's letter is surely proof enough. This is absurd. You're arguing in circles. So what if I am? Look, Duke Bakshiel, do you really want to make an enemy of the Osran Greyrat family? Reese thought, crap, I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. Fortunately, the threat I blurted out did seem to have some sort of effect, judging by how sharply Duke Bakshiel was glaring at me. Very well then. I'll permit you and the young lady to book passage then. But our guard, by my authority as Duke, I will assign a few knights to escort you. Surely that would be preferred over the protection of this demon. Rudeus thought, compared to granting a demon passage, Bakshiel preferred to loan us a couple of his own men. He seemed stubbornly determined not to let Reserved through. No matter what, I haven't seen this sort of thing with my own eyes before. But the discrimination against demon kind on this continent was evidently worse than I had imagined. What option did we even have at this point? Should we just try arrange passage for Reserved separately? I can easily see resulting in another bloody battle against a group of smugglers. Really didn't feel too appealing. But just as I was considering my response, there was a sharp knock at the door. "What is it? I'm in the middle of something," said Bakshiel, looking a bit suspicious. The person outside didn't wait for permission to enter. The door swung open, and a blonde woman in blue armor stepped in the room. "Pardon me, I was told a certain dead-end Reserved was here." "Mother?" "It was Zenith." "Huh?" Everyone in the room turned in unison to look at her. The woman stared down at me, looking somewhat miffed. "I'm a single woman. I don't have any children, let alone one as old as you." Rudeus thought, "Say what? Come on now, Mom. Did you lose your memory since the last time I saw you?" "Oh, maybe she was just sick of Paul's nonsense." As I looked more closely at the woman, though, I began to notice a few details that were different from my mother. After years apart, I couldn't remember Zenith perfectly, but the shape of the woman's face and the color of her hair were very subtly different. It wasn't her, after all. Rudeus then said, "I'm sorry. My mother's missing, and you look a great deal like her." "I see." Rudeus thought, great, now she's looking at me with pity in her eyes. Maybe she pegged me as some lonely lost child or something. People didn't treat me like a kid too often these days, but I still look like one at least. With a snort, Duke Bakshiel glared at the armored woman. "Well, if it isn't our freshly demoted temple knight. Do you need something from me?" A Superb appeared in the mill's territory. Any diligent member of the order would come running at the news. "You don't assume your post here for another 10 days. Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong." "Where it doesn't belong? What a strange thing to say, Duke Bakshiel. To be sure, I haven't yet officially assumed my duties here, but my predecessor has already departed for Milshin. When problems arise at a checkpoint, it's the Temple Knight's responsibility to address them, correct? And yet I seem to be the only Temple Knight in the room. Would you care to explain that?" This diatribe left the man at a loss for words. He stammered slightly, his face a bit pale. "A team of 2 leaders should oversee the defense of every customs post. That is an ironclad rule established by the Millish Church, Duke Bakshiel. Surely you don't intend to defy it?" "Of course not. I only thought, well, you've only just arrived here. Why not take a few days to relax and grow accustomed to the city?" "That won't be necessary." Rudeus thought, from the look on Duke Piggy's face, you might have thought that he was in line to be slaughtered. I was really going to enjoy the next time I was going to eat some pork. The Lady Knight spoke up again. "Now then, could you explain what was being discussed here?" All in all, it seemed like the Lady Knight was on equal footing with Bakshiel here. Normally, a duke would be at the very top of aristocratic pecking order. But, in the holy country of Millis, the church was extremely powerful in its own right. That system probably had something to do with this. "Well, as it happens," Duke Bakshiel proceeded to summarize the situation. At times, he threw in remarks based solely on his own assumptions, so I had to interject with a few corrections. The knight listened to the entire story in silence, then looked over at our party. That man certainly is a demon, isn't he?" She narrowed her eyes to study Reserved, but as she turned to Eris, her expression instantly softened. Finally, she met my gaze, and put her hand to her chin thoughtfully. "Young man, you thought I was your mother, yes? Might I ask your name?" "It's Zenith. Zenith Greyrat." "And your father's?" I glanced over to Bakshiel. Man, this is going to be awkward. "Paul Greyrat." Understandably enough, the Duke's eyes went wide. I just have to insist that my father was a totally different person. Not that scumbag back in Milshin. My daddy was basically a saint. He'd even give you money if you punched him a few times. That line gets me every time. "I see," murmured the knight. And then, for some reason, she squatted down and wrapped her arms around me. "Huh?" This came something of a surprise, to say the least. "I can't imagine what you've gone through." Not only was she hugging me, now she was stroking my head as well. This wasn't the softest embrace, thanks to the thick armor that she had on, but at least I was getting a nice whiff of feminine fragrance. Naturally, my little buddy downstairs didn't even twitch. "Huh? What's the matter, my boy? I thought you loved the smell of slightly sweaty women." "Why, just the other day, it only took one whiff of Eris to get you going." Glancing over at the young lady in question, I found her staring at us, her eyes wide open, and her hands clenched into fists. Talk about terrifying. Rudeus spoke up. Miss?" After patting me on the head a few times, the knight rose to her feet once again, and instead of looking in my direction, she turned back to Duke Bakshiel. "I'll take these 3 under my personal protection." "What? One of them is a demon, woman!" Keeping him in the corner of her eye, the knight snatched Reserve's letter from my hands and quickly looked it over. "This letter is authentic. I recognize Sir Galgard's handwriting when I see it. Would you ignore the teaching of the Mills Church completely? What sort of temple knight are you?" At this point, Eris let out a, "Oh!" The Lady Knight turned to her for a moment and winked. I was starting to feel completely lost. "I'm a captain of the Shield Company, and I am quite serious about this." "Pah! A captain demoted for losing her entire unit? Aren't your own circumstances quite similar?" "No, my mistake. I at least completed my mission, whereas you simply abandoned your duty." Duke Bakshiel ground his teeth together and growled. From the sound of things, he'd been sent here as some sort of punishment as well. Once you knew that little detail, his grand title actually seemed more pathetic than intimidating. There was something like real hatred in his eyes now. Look, woman, I don't care how powerful your family is. This sort of insolence will not. Bakshiel wasn't able to finish his sentence. Halfway through it, the knight bowed her head to him. I apologize. My words were uncalled for. Since I have been assigned here, I have no desire to put myself in conflict with you. However, this particular matter is of personal significance to me. I hope you'll forgive my rudeness. It was a seriously impressive timing. She fired off everything she wanted to say, but then apologized at once. You could see the anger in Bakshiel's face fading. I'd have to try to imitate her next time I really pissed someone off. Personal significance? Yes. With a small nod to her dubious colleague, she then dropped one hand on my shoulder. This boy is my nephew, you see. Rudeus thought, pardon? Therese Latria was the fourth-born daughter of the Latria family, a cornerstone of the Millis nobility. She was also a highly promising knight who had won the rank of captain in the Temple Knights at a remarkably young age. Count Latria was her father, and Zenith Greyrat was her sister. Once he learned that I was a blood relative of Therese, Duke Bakshiel's face took a resigned expression. With a reluctant sigh, he agreed to waive the fare for my party's passage to the central continent. At the moment, I was in an inn in Westport, wrapped in Therese's arms. Only Eris, Therese, and myself were in the room at the moment. Perhaps sensing it might be awkward if he stayed, Reserved slipped away for a moment. You know, Rudeus, my sister told me all about you in her letters. Did she? Really? What did she say about me? That you're adorable, mainly. I can't say that that's the first word that came to mind when I saw you in the office, but now I get it. You're cute as a button, all right. Even as she spoke, Therese was nuzzling her face affectionately against the back of my neck. This was a bit of an unusual experience for me. Over the last 13 years, quite a few people would describe me as creepy, impotent, or suspicious. But Zenith was the only one that ever called me cute. In any case, despite that fact, I was currently being embraced by a beautiful woman with large breasts. For some strange reason, my railgun between my legs wasn't firing off any coins. Now that I thought about it, my victory never did stand up for Zenith either. And I never felt any interest in getting more friendlier than necessary with Norn. Was it just because they were my relatives? Therese, can you let go of Rudeus already? Eris watched us with her chin propped up on one hand, drumming her fingers irritably against the table. Was this a bit of jealousy, perhaps? It wasn't easy being such a playboy. I can understand how you feel, Miss Eris, but there's no telling the next time I'll see Rudeus. And by the time we're reunited, he'll most likely have lost all vestiges of cuteness he now possesses. My sincerest apologies, but I'd like to make some memories with him while I can. Therese proceeded to nuzzle me more vigorously than before, showing no signs of stopping. Can I ask why you're speaking so politely to Eris? Because I owe her my life. Now, that piqued his interest. On the day that Eris went out goblin slaying near Milshan, she apparently rescued Therese and her group from assassins who surrounded her. Therese had been on duty defending a certain important personage at the time. If Eris hadn't showed up when she did, both Therese and her charge would have lost their lives. This is all news to me. When I looked over to Eris, she had a slightly embarrassed expression on her face. Sorry, I forgot to tell you about any of this. From what Eris told me, once she got back to the inn and saw how depressed I was, she'd forgotten all about everything else that had taken place that day. It was basically my fault, huh? In that case, I couldn't really complain. Therese was still groping me like crazy, incidentally. Since she was sitting behind me, it was hard to say for sure, but I bet the woman had a pretty blissful expression on her face. This didn't nauseate me or anything, but it was definitely kind of awkward. I mean, I had a lady pressing her breast against me and playing with my body, and I wasn't remotely excited. It was a very unfamiliar feeling. Seriously though, you're just too cute, Rudeus. I could eat you all up. Sorry, does that mean you want to sleep with me? Therese's response to this modest attempt of humor was to cover my mouth with her hand. You're definitely cuter when you stay quiet. Hearing you talk brings Paul Greyrat to mind. It seemed my aunt wasn't a big fan of my dad. Petting me like a puppy, she went ahead and changed the subject. Anyways, Commander Gash never changes. He must have known how Duke Bakshiel would have reacted to the letter like that, but he went and wrote it anyways. Galgard Nash Vennik was, in fact, the man in command of the Missionary Knights of Millis. The order was essentially a mercenary force. They dispatched young knights to turbulent regions of the world. There, they would gain real combat experience while also spreading the teaching of the Millis Church. At present, they were between campaigns, and had returned to Millis to bolster their ranks with new recruits. Reserved's buddy, Gash, aka Galgard, had been the leader for some time now. He survived a disastrous expedition to the Demon Continent as a young knight, and in the decades since, he had reshaped this order into the strongest force it had ever been. He was a brusque and quiet man who rarely so much as smiled, but he was also known for his fairness and impartiality towards the most worst of villains. In Millis, no one was considered a full-fledged knight until they experienced at least one expedition with the Missionary Knights. These campaigns were often highly dangerous, but with Gash in charge, more than 90% of the young knights dispatched now returned alive. This was the reason why many hailed him as the greatest commander the order had ever seen. Every knight in the three holy military orders respected Gash deeply. Many even owed him their lives. Therese continued. Of course, he's also famous for writing little and saying less. Apparently on the battlefield, he would snap off orders quickly and precisely, but at most other times, he was too apathetic to even return an officer's greeting. He almost never wrote letters of any kind, and merely rubber-stamped reports that others wrote. So few people had ever seen his handwriting that fake documents routinely circulated in his name. Rizard had described him as a talkative and passionate man. But of course, Rizard was pretty closed-mouthed himself. Maybe his standards for talkative differed from ours. Or maybe Gash just acted differently around him. Okay, look, interrupted Eris. Are you ever gonna let go of him? I could see the girl was about 5 seconds from snapping at this point. So, I finally slipped away from Therese's grasp. Oh, my nice warm Rudeus. My aunt looked mildly heartbroken, but I wasn't her body pillow. And it's not like I was really enjoying the experience anyways. Eris barked out, "Come here, Rudeus." Just as ordered, I sat down next to Eris. She promptly grabbed and held my hand. Within seconds, the girl was blushing to the tips of her ears. Staring at the side of her face, she glared forward. I couldn't help smiling. Therese, on the other hand, was busy punching a pillow on the bed. Understandable, but why not punch the wall instead? That's much more satisfying in my experience. Ha! Enjoy your youth while you have it, kids. Therese shook her head with a sigh. Then, she looked at them with a serious expression. Right, there's one thing I want to warn you about, Rudeus. It might not matter too much since you're about to leave Millis, but I think you should be aware of it. She paused for a moment after this long lead-in, and then continued firmly. You'd be smarter not to mention the word superb within the country's borders. Why's that? One of the Millis Church's older teachings holds that the demon kind should be totally expelled. Specifically, this meant that all demons should be driven from the Millis continent. It was currently something of a dead doctrine that few took seriously, but the Temple Knights were still striving to put this into practice. And of course, the Superbs were particularly infamous, even amongst the demon races. If word got out about one moving through Millis, the Knights would come after him with everything they had, even if he wasn't really who he claimed to be. Given everything that he had done for you and Eris, I have to make an exception in this case, but ordinarily, I wouldn't have overlooked this. Eris spoke up coldly. Don't be ridiculous. You'd never beat Rizard, even in a million years, no matter how many people you threat him. I suppose you might be right about that, Miss Eris, said Therese, smiling wryly. But the Temple Knights are a bunch of fanatics, I'm afraid. Myself included. We'd fight any battle, even if we didn't stand a chance. There were apparently quite a few people like this amongst the Holy Knights of Millis. And so, she emphasized, we should be very careful if we ever returned to the Millis continent. This whole incident really drove home just how deep-seated humanity's prejudice were towards the demon kind. I felt like it might be tough to work on the reputation of the Superbs from here on out. Also, should anyone learn that I venerated Roxy like a god, I might end up being tortured by some heavy-breathing inquisitor or something. It was probably best to keep my personal religion to myself. Our trip across the sea went smoothly this time. My aunt made sure that we were well prepared for the voyage. Not only did she provide all the provisions we needed, she also got us some sort of medicine for seasickness. I was under the impression that medicine was kind of a neglected field in this world, but evidently they didn't rely on healing magic for everything. There was remedies for this kind of illness, at least. That said, such medicines didn't come cheap. Good thing I had relatives in high places. Therese took particular care to accommodate Eris's every need. There was always some hostility in her eyes when she looked to Rizard, but what can you do? People don't change their whole perspectives on the world overnight. Thanks to the medicine that Therese provided, Eris spent most of the voyage mildly uncomfortable rather than completely miserable, which meant that she wasn't begging me to use healing on her the whole time. To be perfectly honest, so it was a little bit disappointing. I'd been hoping to see her all meek and mild again. But on the plus side, my super meter didn't charge up. I never unleashed my Buster Wolf, and Eris never needed to hit me with a sunny punch. It was business as usual. Eris did seem to be a bit anxious after last time though. Since she stuck to me like glue once we got on the boat, she definitely wasn't meek at any point. But at least I got to see her hopping around in delight as we looked out at the sea. That was good enough for me. One of the sailors took the opportunity to tease us though. Hey there, lovebirds. You two getting hitched in the King Dragon realm or what? Reese replied, you bet, as he put his arms around Eris with a grin. It's gonna be one crazy wedding. At this point, Eris punched me in the face. It's way too early to get married, stupid. Despite the violence, she didn't seem too displeased about the idea itself. Judging by the way that she was fidgeting around afterwards, the public teasing part of it probably was the main issue. If I wanted to bring up this subject, it should be in a nice, quiet place, with just the two of us, and only once the right mood was established. Eris was a monster of a swordsman by now, but she was still an innocent maiden when it came to romance. Still, marriage, huh? Philip and the others certainly tried to push them towards that, but now, nobody even knew where they were. Paul did say not to be too optimistic. It wasn't just Philip. Saros, and company, of course. Zenith, Lilia, and little Aisha was still missing too. There was no news on Sylphie either. Heck, we didn't even know if Gillian was still alive. There was so many reasons to be anxious. Still, I couldn't let myself sink into pessimism. By the time we got back to Fatoa, maybe everyone would be waiting for us there, safe and sound. I knew it wasn't remotely likely, but at the same time, tearing my hair out and worry wasn't going to do any good at the moment. That was what I told myself, at least. For better or worse, we put Millis continent behind us. And that is the skipped to the Central Continent chapter. Therese is so good. I told many people, I think, of course, my number one most disliked skipped content of the first season of the anime adaptation was for sure Eris's perspective in Volume 6. It was the whole story that tells Eris's whole life story and the whole journey, her whole perspective, and her whole thought process, all the way up to the point they reached the refugee camp. But this right here, this chapter is not just Therese. A lot of this has to do with Rudeus. It has to do with this Gash Broche character that Rudeus apparently knew that the anime completely doesn't even talk about. They don't even mention the letter. And even when they get to the boat, when they travel to the Central Continent, you even see in the anime, Eris is vomiting still. Like, it's still showing her having, like, this massive seasickness. Like, they don't even, like, have the aspect that she technically enjoyed the trip across the sea this time. But yeah, like, the most part of this is I really hate the fact that we never got to see this moment. Honestly, I would have lost it to have that moment where Rudeus is in Duke Bakshiel's office, and literally this girl walks in the door, and she looks like the spitting image of Zenith, and Rudeus just looks over and says, "Mom?" It would have been like a massive mind blow moment. Now, granted, technically, I even think at that point, I think we got that episode before we even seen Eris the Goblin Slaying chapter. So it would have been super crazy to see that moment. But honestly, Therese herself is a significant thing because it's not just her. I like seeing more of that character. I like getting more into her character. But the bigger thing here is really she's a great insight into the holy country of Milis, into the Temple Knights. These Temple Knights that have the Inquisitors and stuff that are going out there and taking down the heresy. Like, these are the ones that there's actually another skip segment in this particular volume where Rudeus and them actually go out and do quests in the holy country of Milis. And when they get out to this one farm where they kill these monsters that were coming in and attacking the farm, Rudeus gave them a figure of Rudeus. And they immediately they push it back to him. No, we don't want this. They knew it was a figure of a demon. If they kept that, brought that to their home, even if they saved them, the Temple Knights seen it, they'd probably burn down the whole town. That's how fanatical they are. The idea here is that you have multiple factions within the church itself. And there's currently a power struggle happening. We found that out in the Eris the Goblin Slaying chapter. From Cliff's perspective, we see that, yes, there's a power struggle. The Blessed Child. The Pope send assassins to kill the Blessed Child because she's a possible future Pope. But many of these factions within the church itself all see things differently. They see things like the demon kind being in the continent differently than each other. Some are perfectly fine with it. Others want to get rid of them. Others want to completely expel them. And what Therese is saying here is, I'm one of them. And if it weren't for the fact that Eris literally saved my life, but not only did Eris save her life, but Eris, in saving her, allowed her to complete her mission, delivering this Blessed Child to where she needed to go. She not only saved her life, but she saved her career. She saved her honor. But she obviously still got demoted because she lost the rest of her men. But that's the only reason. The only reason is because of Eris that she doesn't immediately probably attack Rudeus on the spot right there. She's saying there are many out there, the knights, that would come swarming to this location if they knew that a superb Rudeus was here. I would too. Eris is like, you would all die. You would never beat him. Therese says, I would still fight. Just like them, I would still fight. That's how fanatical we are. But additionally, she's giving Rudeus that warning. If you come back here, be careful. Be careful with that kind of stuff. And even still, like, it literally just says, in general, when you come back, be careful. Somebody might have heard you say that, and they might come after you. It's a pretty ominous little warning. But again, I love Therese, though. I think she's super cute. I love that little picture. They're snuggling with him. And yes, Rudeus, just like he had an experience with Aisha later on, when Rudeus goes to save Aisha and Lilia, he'll have that same feeling. Like, yeah, normally this cuteness of her, like, normally, yeah, that would do something to me. But Rudeus, this entire time, every time he has these weird encounters with people that are blood related, he's starting to realize that he's not, aroused by that. It's something that he can't quite understand. This is somebody that spent his entire previous life, obviously, looking at inappropriate stuff online, and he has a lot of sibling type stuff, and he would think that he'd be into it, but when it actually is in play, this is my aunt behind me. Suddenly things aren't working, and he can't figure it out. It's just very weird. It's a very weird thing about Rudeus that he constantly struggles with. Yeah, I mean, he eventually gets over it. I think with the whole thing with Aisha, I think at that point he kind of just gives up on it. But it is kind of an oddity there. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video as always. If you did, make sure that like button down below, comment. Let me know what you think of Therese. Do you like Therese? No spoilers down there. Nobody spoil things down there. This is anime onlys here. Get out of here. Additionally, if you like this content, if you appreciate this content and you're able to, I have a Patreon link, a tips link, super thanks, membership button down below. I greatly appreciate it, but it supports the channel. It means so much to me. It's because of you guys that stuff keeps going. But yes, until the next Mushoku Sundays, or the next Mushoku Mondays, if you're watching that as well, y'all take care.